Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm delighted to be with you from a beautiful autumn in Chicago. So my title is The Church as Spotless Bride, a feminist critique of a harmful metaphor. So in this lecture, I will try to offer a response to the frequent use of the feminine metaphor of the bride of Christ in church teaching and literature, by arguing that the church as a whole, that is, both clergy and laity, needs to grapple with the ways that the church itself has been feminized, what this means, and what it would take to move forward as a church of genuine equality for women and men. Now, I write this in the wake of various revelations of sexual abuse in the church, including the 2018 revelations of Cardinal Theodore McCarrick's preying on seminarians, the Pennsylvania grand jury report, and the names of priests who have been credibly accused of sexual abuse of minors, released by a number of dioceses and provinces of religious orders. And of course, this is in the USA. There's more in other countries. I also note that in the October 2018 Synod on the Family, women were excluded from having any vote in the deliberations, while non-ordained male religious were given voting status. Now, more recently, the Synod on Synodality has responded to Pope Francis's call for transparency, and in fact, women do vote in the Synod. Yet the work of the two committees on the possibility of women deacons has been remarkably opaque. The scandal of clergy sex abuse, devastating as it is to victims and their families, is also a scandal of clericalism, which elevates the clergy above the laity, especially the feminine laity. The elevated state of clerics and the feminization of the laity is the concern of this lecture. Many women, including me, this writer, have found themselves asking the same question Bernard Prusak asked in 2006. Is there any future for women in the church? But the question can be extended to ask, is there any future for a greater role for laity in the church? If there is to be a future that is different from the present, one essential step is to challenge the feminine nature attributed to the church and all that is associated with it. There are significant connections between the ways that women in the laity have been described and understood. Both are seen as feminine and in need of male leadership. These characterizations make it all the more difficult to imagine ways of more fully incorporating their voices in church structure and governance. This lecture will proceed in the following steps. First, I will review the ways that the spousal language in both the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament have been interpreted by feminist scholars. I will show how the language of Israel and later of the church is having a bridal character in relation to God, although having ancient roots is deeply problematic. Second, I will examine the language used in and for the church in such places as the Catechism of the Catholic Church and in recent theology, to show how femininity is reinforced not only intellectually, but also affectively with feelings. I will also take a brief look at Pope Francis's comments on women. What these examples reveal is that the feminization of the people results not only in structures of unequal power, but also in attitudes and actions that are potentially and actually harmful to women as well as to the laity. I will then suggest alternative language that not only avoids these pitfalls, but also suggests a more robust sense of empowerment for women and the laity. First, Israel and the church's bride. Spousal language for the human-divine relationship has a long history in religion. In the ancient Near East, the gods and goddesses modeled marital relationships for human beings, and their union was thought to ensure the fertility of the crops. While the Hebrew scriptures repeatedly inveigh against the worship of the divinities of the Israelites' Canaanite neighbors, the religious practices of ancient Israel reveal the persistence of the people's continued devotion to a variety of gods and goddesses. Now, to what extent Israelite religion can be said to be truly monotheistic is a question I am not equipped to answer. But the place of spousal language and the use of the marriage metaphor to convey a message about the people's relationship to the divine is a topic that has received increased critical attention in recent years. There are some scholars who see the marriage metaphor as a positive one, some of whom will be discussed in the next section. There is a long tradition for this language with deep roots in ancient religions. But feminist scholars are suspicious of the ways that this metaphor has been used to portray Israel as the faithless wife, or even the harlot, and to justify its punishment as what is due to a wife who cheats on her faithful husband. Renita Weems' book, Battered Love, Marriage, Sex, and Violence in the Hebrew Prophets, is a thoughtful yet scathing treatment of the use of the marriage metaphor in Hosea, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah, and its effect not only in the past, but also in the present. Weems emphasizes the power of the metaphor in the prophetic use of marital imagery, and I quote from her: "The enduring benefit of convincing audiences to see the relationship between Israel and God as a marriage was that the prophets could exploit what was sure to be a range of widely held, deeply felt attitudes about marriage to shape their audience's thinking about God's claim upon Israel. What better way of personifying that claim than by using as an analogy a human relationship where issues of power, propriety, property, and purity were profoundly at stake?" Close quote. The relationship between Hosea and his wife Gomer, as the prophet tells it, mirrors the relationship between God and Israel. As the story is told, Israel has been unfaithful to God through its practice of idol worship. The prophet's role is to bring the people back to worship of the one God. To make this relationship come alive, Hosea is told to marry Gomer, a harlot, and they have 3 children, all named symbolically. Their names are punishment, lack of pity, not my people. Gomer is described as an adulteress, and Hosea expresses his fury at her actions by humiliating her, stripping her, and revealing her shame before her lovers. Although she is unfaithful, Hosea will not abandon her, but his fidelity to her also exacts a high price from her. The story is meant to exemplify God's fidelity to Israel despite its infidelity to God. Weems' exploration of the marriage metaphor in Hosea, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah focuses on the ways that marriage is a familiar relationship, one that evokes powerful feelings. As she notes, and I quote, "Audiences must care about the social picture the metaphor is capturing. More than images of, say, a vine or a flock of sheep, the metaphor of marriage taps into deep feelings and attitudes about relationships between men and women. In this relationship, men are the injured ones in power, and women symbolize the unfaithful and sinful wife Israel. So the metaphor becomes more than just a metaphor. It draws on the actual dynamics in marital relationships, a world where, as Weems observes, a woman could be forced to marry her rapist, a woman's activity had the potential to bring shame on her husband and family, and where a woman's body needed, above all, to be controlled. Weems further observes that, and again I quote, "The image of the subdued wife and the conquering husband is a familiar scene in Western literature." And I would add, also in popular cultural portrayals, such as films. There is a scene in the classic film Gone with the Wind from 1939 when Rhett Butler forcibly carries his wife Scarlett to bed after a fight, and where in the following scene she is portrayed with a knowing smile on her face. Other more recent examples could include Latin American telenovas, vampire stories, Disney films, and Game of Thrones, the HBO series. As Weems notes, metaphors matter, finally, because they teach us how to imagine what has previously remained unimaginable. To be sure, not every portrayal of marriage in the Hebrew scriptures is violent or demeaning to women. There are the complicated relationships of such couples as Abraham and Sarah, where Abraham lies to the Egyptians about Sarah being his wife, Jacob and Rebekah, where Jacob was forced to marry Rebekah's sister Leah first, or David and Bathsheba, whose relationship was based on the murder of Bathsheba's first husband Uriah by David, and where even the prophet Nathan portrays Bathsheba as poor Uriah's property. There is also that of Ruth and Boaz, where Ruth initiates their sexual relationship. We can also look at the relationship of the unmarried couple in the Song of Songs, where the woman has a voice and where the relationship suggests joyful mutuality. Nevertheless, ancient Israel was undeniably a patriarchal society where a woman's worth was often dependent on her ability to bear children, preferably sons, and where her potential infidelity posed a threat to the stability of Israelite society. The marriage metaphor was a powerful way of portraying the relationship between Israel and God, but it also played on real human relationships where male control and female submission was unquestioned. There are, of course, other women who take on the role of judge or warrior, such as Judith, Deborah, and Esther, but they are exceptions. Although his topic was the apocryphal and pseudepigraphical literature of ancient Israel and early Christianity, Bernard Prusak came to a similar conclusion about the consequences of the ways that women were depicted in variations of the stories of the origins of evil. He observes that the ancient authors, and I quote, explained the de facto existence of evil by indicting women as its source, and thereby also had both a theological explanation and the justification for maintaining the cultural facts of male dominance and female subservience. Here again, women are the means through which the most negative dimensions of human behavior are portrayed. The connection between metaphors and actual practices is further reinforced here through familiar images of untrustworthy and irresponsible women. The marriage metaphor found renewed life in early Christianity. Although its Pauline authorship is debated, the letter to the Ephesians has canonical status and draws on the language of marriage to model relationships within the early Christian community. Here, the spousal language is used to describe a different relationship, that of the spotless bride and her bridegroom, Christ. In her article, The Bride of Christ, and this is based on Ephesians 5:22-23, and the subheading is A Problematic Wedding, Carolyn Osick argues that this passage establishes the church as the successor to Israel as God's lover, and concludes that, and I quote, as long as the marriage metaphor is in play, gender symbolism is fixed. I'm going to just take a little cough drop here because I am getting over a cold. As in the marriage metaphor in the Hebrew prophets, the woman becomes the symbol of the people. But in this case, the woman is not the harlot, but the spotless bride. The bridal language of Ephesians also has a different context than that of Hosea. Rather than the problematic relationship of faithful husband and unfaithful wife, the Ephesians text is concerned with household relationships in the early Christian community. Osick argues that this text serves as a way of understanding the, and she quotes, I quote, formation of proper relationships within the household as a microcosm of the church. In addition, a concern for purity emerges in the text. And Osick notes that its association with baptism would have been obvious to the early Christian communities. As with the adulterous wife in the First Testament prophetic texts, the significance of female chastity and purity is not only relevant to the family structure, but also to civil symbolism. Here, Osick quotes the scholar Margaret MacDonald. As in Paul's letters, there is the idea that in Ephesians 5, the union with the pure female body has symbolic importance in expressing the nature of the separation from a past way of life. As a reflection of the holy and unblemished church, the pure bride stands in contrast to the evil world outside. And that's the end of the quotation. Female chastity is identified with orthodoxy in the analogous relationship of husband to wife and Christ to the church is firmly established. Now, two issues are in play here. One is the domination-submission relationship of husband and wife. The second is the importance of purity on the part of the wife. The hierarchical relationship of submission in this passage is often explained and even excused by the point that mutual submission is the point, as in Ephesians 5:21, which reads, defer to one another out of reverence for Christ. But Osick notes that, in her words, in spite of the exhortation to mutual submission in 5:21, however, here, submission is a woman thing. Wives are not to obey as our children and slaves. The terminology is different. And I close quote here. The husband is the head of the wife as Christ is head of the church. And as Osick further observes, the term used for submission carries connotations of respectful rather than servile yielding, but very definitely of inferior subject to authoritative superior. The point is that the church has a relationship of subjection to Christ as the bride does to her husband. And again, here, the feminine character of the church is underscored. Osick's critique of this language is complex, delving into the ways that echoes of the traditional Jewish ritual bath before marriage are evoked, how the shy, pure virgin bride is presented to her presumably more experienced husband, and how headship is used to describe Christ's relationship to his church. Her central point is that the symbolism is still maintained as justification for the all-male priesthood and for ecclesial gender relations in the present. And I quote her conclusion, which is a little long. She writes, I would argue that casting the church as feminine and above all as bride of Christ far from enhancing the dignity of women, has in fact done harm to perceptions of the capacity of women to image the divine, and thus of women's fundamental human and Christian dignity. It does no good to affirm the full dignity and equality of women with men if our language, our imagery, and our metaphors continue to perpetuate inequality. I would underscore here the power of language and metaphor to shape both thinking and feeling, and the pervasiveness of this metaphor in much of the language of the church. In this case, words have real power. Now I move to section 2, contemporary Catholicism and the church as bride. Does contemporary language for the church continue to perpetuate inequality? A logical place to explore the language used for the church is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. The Catechism is considered to be one of, if not the most, authoritative text for church teaching. Within the Catechism, the church itself is considered under the discussion of the section of the Nicene Creed, which says, I believe in the Holy Catholic Church. This section on the church begins by considering names and images of the church. Beginning with the Greek root of the Latin term ecclesia, the Catechism first describes the church as the assembly of the people. The section then goes on to list other terms that are used to describe the church: people of God, sheepfold, cultivated field, building of God, and Jerusalem, the holy city. This list of terms is very much in accord with the way the church is described in Lumen Gentium, Vatican II's dogmatic constitution on the church, light to the people. The list of terms, however, culminates with this familiar language, and I quote from the Catechism. The church, further, which is called that Jerusalem which is above and our mother, is described as the spotless spouse of the spotless Lamb. It is she whom Christ loved and for whom he delivered himself up that he might sanctify her. It is she whom he unites to himself by an unbreakable alliance and whom he constantly nourishes and cherishes. Throughout the entire section on the church, the pronoun used for the church is always feminine. Some examples. We begin our investigation of the church's mystery by meditating on her origin in the Holy Trinity's plan and her progressive realization in history. It is interesting to note that the language for humanity is man, as one finds in language referring to the fact that God calls all men. And it is important to recall here that in the process of translating the Latin text of the Catechism into English, the first version used what we call inclusive language, avoiding references to all of humanity as men by including sisters when brothers were mentioned, and by referring to humanity and people instead of man. This inclusivity, however, proved to be objectionable and unacceptable to many. And after protests were made to the Vatican, the entire Catechism was retranslated using the traditional generic man for humanity and exclusively male language for God. The description of the church in the Catechism continues with more feminine references to the church, and just a few here. As Eve was formed from the sleeping Adam's side, so the church was born from the pierced heart of Christ hanging on the cross. As the convocation of all men for salvation, the church in her very nature is missionary, so that she can fulfill her mission, etc. Here below, she knows that she is an exile from the Lord. The Catechism then goes on to flesh out some of the traditional metaphors for the church: people of God, body of Christ, temple of the Holy Spirit. Then, in paragraph 796, the language of bride of Christ is reintroduced within the section on the body of Christ. Here, Christ is described as the bridegroom, and the church is the spotless bride of the spotless Lamb. In the light of Osik's critique of the conjunction of leadership and bride, in the light of Osik's critique of the conjunction of headship and bride language, it is interesting to note the footnote references to Ephesians 5. Later, in the section that explains the church is holy, there are more references to Ephesians 5 and to the church as bride. There's a quotation. This is because Christ, the Son of God, who with the Father and the Spirit is hailed as alone holy, loved the church as his bride. And the section on Christ faithful, hierarchy, laity, consecrated life, the virgin is described as an eschatological image of this heavenly bride of Christ in the life to come. Now, the timing of the Catechism and the controversies surrounding its translation are significant. The Catechism was officially promulgated by Pope John Paul II in 1992. Just 4 years earlier, in 1988, John Paul issued his encyclical Mulieris Dignitatem on the dignity and vocation of woman. This document was in many ways a response to the global women's movement that emerged in the 60s through the 1980s, the ordination of women in many Protestant denominations beginning in the 1950s, as well as the ultimately unsuccessful efforts of the U.S. Catholic bishops to write a pastoral letter on women's concerns, which is another story. In Mulieris, John Paul pays special attention to the spousal dynamic between men and women and how it applies to the church. In his interpretation of the way that Jesus related to women, John Paul notes, Christ's attitude towards women serves as a model of what the letter to the Ephesians expresses with the concept of bridegroom. Precisely because Christ's divine love is the love of a bridegroom, it is the model and pattern of all human love, men's love in particular. Supporters of this position emphasize the connection between the marriage metaphor and the church. Donald Keefe, for example, in response to questions about the ordination of women, writes the following. If it be true that masculinity and femininity are thus sacramental, and that all human existence is engaged in this signing, it must follow that the only paradigms by which the mystery, the meaning of masculinity and femininity may be approached are those provided by the marital relationship between Christ and his church, between the head and the body, a polarity intrinsic to the new covenant, to the new creation, to the imaging of God. Now, one of the major modern theological advocates for understanding the church as bride is the Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar. In his multi-volume work, The Glory of the Lord, as well as in his other writings, Balthasar repeatedly turns to Mary and what he calls the Marian principle as central to the nature of the church. He also bases his understanding on Ephesians 5, arguing, contrary to scholarly consensus, that Paul was the actual author of the letter. As his interpreter, W.T. Dickens, puts it, in Mary and only in her, the church is at once the immaculate mother of Christ as well as his spotless bride. Mary best exemplifies the receptive dimension of the church. Similarly, in the 1976 Vatican Statement on the question of the ordination of women, Inter in Seniores, Christ is described as the bridegroom and head of the church. As bridegroom, the document notes, Jesus is necessarily a male. These examples make clear that the bridal language for the church is alive and well in the 20th and 21st centuries. And the strong resistance to inclusive language in the Catechism, as well as other efforts to be more inclusive in liturgical language, make it clear that gendered language for the church and for humanity are not mere words. Some years ago, Richard John Newhouse, a convert to Catholicism from Lutheranism, declared that inclusive language was heretical and that any effort to make liturgical language more inclusive should be dismissed as the work of zealots. It is worth noting the debates that erupted with the publication of the Inclusive Language Lectionary, which is a document that tried to make the Sunday readings all inclusive, and with arguments for changing liturgical language from primarily father-oriented images for God, such as in the Our Father, to how humanity should be referred to, and whether or not to include the language of mother as well as father when mentioning the divine. The point I am making in this talk is related, though not identical, to that larger debate, challenging language that is both ancient and familiar to the ears of the faithful risks much. Yet, the perpetuation of the language of spotless bride for the church evokes the innocent and virginal young woman in relation to the man who possesses both the experience and the responsibility to be her superior and caretaker. To be sinless, innocent, and receptive is far more characteristic of a child than of an adult woman preparing to undertake a lifelong commitment to another person. And as a model for the church, this metaphor is troubling not only for its conception of women, but also for the way the laity is characterized. They may also suggest the strong reluctance to admit the sinfulness of the church itself. A few more examples come from Pope Francis. On his return flight from World Youth Day in 2016, Pope Francis was asked about the role of women in the church. So I'll read in part his response. He writes, he says, "A church without women is like the apostolic college without Mary. The role of women in the church is not only maternity, the mother of the family, but it's stronger. It is, in fact, the icon of the Virgin, of Our Lady, the one who helps the church grow. But think, Our Lady is more important than the apostles. She is more important. The church is feminine. She is church, she is spouse, she is mother. But women in the church not only must, I don't know how it is said in Italian, a woman's role in the church must not end only as mother, as worker, limited. No, it's something else." This is what the Pope said. And then in response to a question from a journalist on that flight, Pope Francis responded, "I would like to explain a bit what I said on the participation of women in the church. It can't be limited to being altar servers or presidents of Caritas, catechists. No, it must be more, but profoundly more." In the years since Pope Francis' election, he has called for a more incisive presence for women in the church. He has appointed women theologians to the International Theological Commission, and he has established yet another commission to study, because this is the second, to study the question of the ordination of women as deacons. Yet, in his 2014 remarks about the appointment of women theologians to the International Theological Commission, Pope Francis commented that women theologians are the strawberry on the cake. Okay, that was 10 years ago. Excuse me. For many women, including me, Pope Francis has been in many ways a breath of fresh air in the church, with his concern for the poor, his likening of the church to a field hospital, his profound gestures of solidarity with migrants and refugees, and his concern with the ecological crisis, and more recently, his concern to decentralize church governance. His disarming greeting to the crowds in St. Peter's Square upon his election and his insistence on living in the guest house rather than the papal apartments have endeared him to many, although it has also alienated some of his conservative critics. But his tone deafness to women's concerns for a voice with actual power in the church has also been frustrating. His insistence that the question of ordination is closed, that the power of a parish priest really belongs to the housekeeper. His comparison of Europe to a grandmother who is no longer fertile and vibrant. It is clear that Francis's agenda is focused on the most economically and socially marginalized in the world, refugees, the devastated earth, the poor, and that the church's priority should be focused on ministering to those who have the least. To be sure, women and children constitute the majority of the marginalized, but the issue of marginalization because of gender is not addressed. While disappointing, there is also something revelatory in Francis's comments. That is to say, they are based in commonly assumed ideas and images of women's maternal, yet also virginal qualities, a paradoxical combination that sees women not as real human beings who lead complex lives, but as idealized icons. And now my third section, the femininity of the church and the role of the laity. In the years since the revelations of clergy sex abuse first came into wide public view, there have been repeated calls for greater lay participation in church governance. Many people have argued that if married people had a more significant role in the governance of parishes and dioceses, there would have been much greater concern for victims, primarily children and adolescents, rather than for the reputation and finances of the priest or the church. Joseph Imish, the late Bishop of Joliet, Illinois, was asked by an attorney in 1995 in a deposition about a priest who had been accused of molesting a child in another diocese, but who was nevertheless brought into Imish's diocese. The lawyer said, "If you had a child," he asked the bishop during the deposition for a civil suit, "wouldn't you be concerned that the priest they were saying mass with had been convicted of sexually molesting children?" Imish replied, "I don't have any children." His failure of empathy and imagination speaks for itself. In March 2003, a conference on the ecclesiological issues raised by the clergy sex abuse crisis was held at Yale University. The volume of essays from the conference focuses on the past, present, and possible future of church structures. The essays are telling in their review of past traditions and the ways that the hierarchical structures of the present church have been normalized and accepted as given. For example, Bishop Donald Wuerl's introductory comments describe the Catholic Church as a divinely established reality, and that the hierarchy and the apostolic tradition are intrinsic to the church. His pronouns for the church are also feminine. To be fair, Wuerl calls for the need to include the laity in parish and diocesan councils, to share financial reports with the laity, and in general for greater openness on the part of the clergy. Nevertheless, some of his assumptions are worth questioning, and his resignation in January 2019 due to his apparent complicity in the cover-up of sexual abuse by clergy doesn't add much to his reputation. In his response to Wuerl, journalist Peter Steinfels expressed his discomfort with some of Wuerl's comments. Steinfels says, "There is something more than a little disconcerting about the swift move from Jesus' constitution of the church to its contemporary manifestation, complete with references in a single sentence to the gospel, magisterial teaching on faith and morals, and canon law, followed in the next sentence by a reference to the structure of the faith and order that is essential to the church." The subsequent essays in the volume offer a rich picture of the historical development of ecclesial governing structures. Francine Cardman, a historian of early Christianity, notes the need to recognize the mythic narrative of ecclesial origins so as to allow for a more accurate picture of the complexity and diversity of the Catholic Church. Francis Oakley, a historian, observes that the tired liturgical refrain that the church is not a democracy is almost always deployed in an attempt to vindicate highly authoritarian ecclesial structures. Canon Law John Beale's comments are particularly appropriate for this essay. In a church structured as a society of unequals, no one is more unequal than lay people. He elaborates on this point. Lay people are primarily passive recipients of clerical ministrations. The church has not yet reached the point where lay people can be respected and treated as intelligent and talented adults with something to contribute to the edification of the church itself. And in his essay, historian John T. McGreevy highlights the inability of the last generation of Catholic leaders to separate authority within the church from gender and the devastating consequences for Catholic credibility. I should note that McGreevy is not arguing the specific point I am attempting to make, that is, the historical feminization of the church has resulted in a feminized, passive, and powerless laity. But the implication is nevertheless still there. He notes the fact that in the last 50 years, women's roles have changed so that it is now expected that women will earn advanced degrees and work outside the home. His point is that the failure on the part of the hierarchy to acknowledge the changing roles of women has resulted in what he calls a deepening alienation of Catholic women from a church hierarchy seen as distant and unsympathetic. My point in referring to the clergy sex abuse crisis in relation to the role of the laity is not to argue that laity are any less likely to abuse children. In fact, most cases of abuse actually occur in families. It is rather that the subordinate and submissive role of laity, as set out in official church policy, makes it far more difficult for laity to have a voice in church issues, and less likely that laity will confront clergy, or when they do, that their voices will not be taken seriously, as the example of complaints about Bishop Michael Bransfield of West Virginia show. He, by the way, spent money ridiculously. No doubt there are more examples of the complex and diverse history of the church and the possibilities for church structures and governance that would be inclusive of the wisdom of laity. As Bernard Prusak writes in his book, The Church Unfinished, the Vatican II decree on the missionary activity of the church affirms that the church is not truly established, nor fully living, nor a perfect sign of Christ among humans, unless there is a mature, active laity working with the hierarchy. The gospel cannot be enculturated into the lives of people by a hierarchy acting alone. It is beyond my task here to determine the nature of the laity's role in a church that may have learned something valuable from the failures of the sex abuse crisis. It is troubling, however, to read the essays from a 2003 conference on the crisis and realize that little has changed in the years since then. There is hope, however, in the recent Synod on Synodality, where lay people were full members and actually had a vote. How much of this decentralization will take place is an open question. In conclusion, let me focus on two issues that arise out of these considerations: the need both to critically examine metaphors and to recognize the competence of the laity. Excuse me. It goes without saying that we cannot live without using metaphors. As biblical scholars, linguists, and literary theorists would argue, language without metaphors would lack vividness, nuance, humor, or the power of emotion. It is, in fact, nearly impossible to describe the place of metaphors without metaphors. But metaphors are not just words, but they are ways of construing reality that have the power to shape our thinking and action. Recall Osik's conclusion to her essay on Ephesians 5. It does no good to affirm the full dignity and equality of women with men if our language, our imagery, and our metaphors continue to perpetuate inequality. My point is that this inequality is not only women's inequality with men, but also the laity's inequality with the hierarchy. As long as the church is seen as the spotless bride of the spotless lamb, the laity will be identified with the feminine bride, and as we have already seen, the clergy with Christ, the spotless lamb. Recall as well how this language is used in Inter Insignores as a further reason to rule out the ordination of women. So there is a need for appropriate metaphors for the church, the hierarchy, and the laity that can do justice both to the tradition and to the contemporary situation. We could go back to Lumen Gentium, which itself refers to the use of metaphors in communicating the meaning of the community. The language of people of God and body of Christ offer images that convey both community and unity. In considering the language that is used for the church, those with the power of shaping the words need to be attentive to the associations and images that are conveyed. A related point is recognition of the competence of the laity, particularly lay theologians. It is important to note that the immense growth in the numbers of lay theologians is a relatively new phenomenon. Before the mid-1960s, Catholic theologians, at least in the US, were nearly all clergy trained to teach in seminaries. There were some lay Catholic theologians who, because they were excluded from the then all-clerical Catholic Theological Society of America until the late 1960s, formed the Association of Catholic College Teachers in 1955, later renamed the College Theology Society. But over the past 60 years, the face of Catholic theologians have changed. There are women and men, parents, men and women religious, in addition to clergy. In addition, many Catholic lay people who are not professional theologians are well-educated, informed, and knowledgeable about how organizations work. The picture of the laity as spotless, innocent, and receptive is no longer adequate, if it ever really was. The too easy identification of clergy with Christ and the laity with a silent and receptive woman, this is in fact a very inadequate picture of Mary, has led to the crisis the church faces in the present. The difficult relationship between Catholic bishops and theologians is one example of how the laity is excluded from having a genuine voice in the church. Particularly during the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, theologians were silenced and or sent away for education, such as Ivane Gabarra. They were called in for questioning, such as Edward Skilovex, removed from pontifical faculties, such as Charles Curran and Roger Haight, challenged by the US bishops, Elizabeth Johnson, or placed under investigation by the Vatican, Margaret Farley. It is worth noting that all of these theologians were either clergy or members of religious communities whose superiors were ultimately responsible to the Vatican. More recently, some lay theologians have been strongly criticized, Michael Lawler and Todd Salzman, but the ability of the hierarchy to affect their employment is hindered by US universities' traditional honoring of academic freedom. My own experience of 4 years of meetings with the Committee on Doctrine of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, while I was in the presidential line of the Catholic Theological Society of America, made clear the discomfort, if sometimes even contempt, that some members of that committee held for Catholic theologians. In 2018 and 2019, requests made by CTSA presidents to meet with the Committee on Doctrine went unanswered. The fact that many theologians today are better educated in theology than many bishops speaks volumes about the fears and concerns on the part of the hierarchy about the potential power of theologians. Under the pontificate of Francis, relationships have definitely improved as investigations have slowed or stopped, and some bishops, some of them appointed by Francis, welcome the contributions of theologians. But then there is still much that could be done to attend to the work of lay Catholic theologians as genuine contributions to the church. Increased efforts to listen to the laity in some dioceses have promised for greater collaboration between clergy and laity, such as the Synod on Amoris Laetitia in San Diego, California. And of course, the Synod on Synodality, now having completed its second year of meetings in Rome, shows the desire of Pope Francis to listen to the voices of all the faithful. My point here is the need to recognize the laity as competent and mature adults who have knowledge and skills that can make significant contributions to the church. But to emphasize, the language of spotless bride is decidedly inappropriate. So a few concluding words. While my aim in this lecture has been to criticize the use of the bridal spousal metaphor for the church, I should note that it would be a mistake to eliminate all gendered metaphors for the church or for God. As I note above, we rely on metaphors to communicate effectively. There are a number of feminist theologians who have suggested a different set of metaphors for God, such as Sally McFaig's mother, lover, friend, and Elizabeth Johnson's Sophia God. We could also note that the way mothers are sometimes portrayed in scriptures is of active caring, such as mother hen, woman looking for a lost coin, of mothers who fight fiercely for their children. Similarly, virgins, while too often understood only as pure and chaste, are in fact women who do not rely on men for their identity. The choice of religious life for women over 2,000 years of Christianity is often a choice for agency, education, time for prayer, active ministry to those in need, and not a simple receptivity to a more powerful man. Another point to make is a recognition of dependence on the part of all humanity. While laity are too often seen as totally dependent on the clergy, all human beings are dependent in various ways. Clergy are dependent on their congregations, their brother clergy for understanding and support, on their bishops, not only for their authority, but also their inspiration, in the best of cases, for leadership. A reliance on outdated images and metaphors, not only for laity and clergy, but also for God, Mary, Christ, and the saints, is long overdue for an overhaul. Bernard Prusak closes his book, The Church Unfinished, by recalling Psalm 104, where it, quote, prayerfully acknowledges that God's Spirit is sent forth to renew the face of the land. It is time now to listen to where the Spirit is moving in the present, in the voices of the whole church, women and laity, clergy and bishops, and to conceive of this new church in language that is inspirational, powerful, and respectful of the full humanity of all its members. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ross. We already have some people who are sending their questions. The first one we have here is from Gabriel Villardi. He asks, could you further elaborate on the relation between sexism and the culture of abuse against women, as well as the muting that involves the expectations of approaching this topic? Who tries to speak out is seen as unfaithful.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think there is such a long-held resistance to any kind of criticism of the clergy. I think that with the case of sexual abuse, it's a multifaceted issue. On the one hand, I think there is the obvious power imbalance between clergy and obviously children, the worst examples of the abuse. But I think also that the identification of the clergy with the divine works for both the clergy and their self-conception, and also the laity who sees the clergy as being in the place of God. And so we need to challenge these ways of understanding, of self-understanding of the clergy and of the laity. And there may be other ways in which we can look at the gendered similarity, and the gendered similarity, or the gendered symbolism, is what I focused on here. But it has to do with power. And so as long as women are seen as mutable, as being able to be controlled by men, we're going to have these abuses. And my point is to say that the laity have also been feminized. And so the theme of the conference is the demasculinization of the church, which is, I think, a wonderful topic. But in a sense, the masculinization of the church has operated with this kind of gendered way of seeing the church and the masculinization and the feminization, how that goes together. And so this is only one example, I think, in terms of gendered language, but I would say that the expectations that people have of clergy have a long history, and they need to be challenged.
Thank you, Professor Ross. Patricia Fakin asks, Rosanna Vigili has criticized the stance of women that act in European politics and advocate policies that are against migrants and are pro-war. And she questions what happened with women and how this sense, maternal sense, transformed in sides of our defense of in a vulgar behavior. I'm quite deceptioned, and that's very bad for the church. The church has been defeated by that.
Yeah. If I understand the question, that the role of women in European politics, and of course now in the US, there's a real resistance to women in power here as well. So what happens? What is it with? Is there a way in which women have a kind of maternal sense to caring for the poor, for the migrants? I think that in this case, women probably see that they have to be, in a sense, more masculine than even the men. So that for a woman to have concern for the powerless is to fall into the feminine idea that women are the ones who are soft. And so a woman who is too soft is not going to be able to be strong enough to lead a country, and is not going to be strong enough to repel the migrants who are champing at the borders. This is obviously an issue in the US as well. So I think that there is still obviously a very strong sexist understanding of what it means to be a woman. I don't want to take away from the idea that the maternal dimension is to be motherly is something that is possible for women as well as men, in the sense that it's nurturing, that it's caring, and that it's bringing out in one sense that softer sense. But what it means is that the woman has to overcompensate to be seen as strong, and that a man then who is in a sense, the Pope Francis has the luxury of being able to be seen as soft and caring for migrants because he is a man, and he can bring that side of himself out. So I think that we still struggle to have adequate pictures of strong women who are able to who are able to be both strong and vulnerable. And we have very, very few examples of power in which strength and vulnerability can coexist. So that is a real problem.
Thank you for the answer. We have a question from Marceni Fais. When I think how much the reality of the church repels me for being a woman, I ask myself how much this is a sign that we carry an ideal that was proposed by Christ. Just a moment, because the comment is long. Just a moment. I can't open the whole comment. I'm sorry. Let me try to solve this. Just a second. I'm gonna ask for help. I'm sorry. I ask how much this is a sign that we carry the ideal that was proposed by Christ in spirit and truth out of the church. This is the question by Marciani. I don't think I quite got his question anyway.
Well, let me try to respond to what I've just heard, which is the image of Christ that we have certainly in the Gospels is that of someone who was very vulnerable, who sided with the people on what we would say is the wrong side of society, who did not want to have power, who was from the lower classes himself. So there are all kinds of ways in which the Jesus of the Gospels, the Jesus who teaches us to love our enemies, who teaches us to be like little children. And it seems that the questioner is asking, where is this in the church today? Because the church is the symbol of big power. I just yesterday saw the film Conclave. I don't know if this has been able to be shown in Brazil. It's the story of the election of the Pope and the kind of politics that goes on behind the scenes. And the images of red vestments, of great processions, of all kinds of glory and power. They seem to, and they are, I think, so contrary to the vision that Jesus had of the small community of followers that he established. I think Pope Francis is trying to make some efforts at this by his, as I said, by his living in the convent, by his refusal to take on some of the, what we would say, the accoutrements of power. I've never seen Pope Francis wear what is called the triple tiara, which is the big crown, the big throne, the big crown that the Pope has traditionally worn. And so I think that that's one dimension of his work that at least appeals to those who think that the church needs to return more to the teaching of Jesus. But two things. So one is that Francis definitely has a blind spot when it comes to women. That I think a lot of clergy share this blind spot where they're unable to really relate to women as real complex human beings. That it's this vision of purity, of the Virgin Mother, of being maternal, of all of that. And the other thing is that the power that the church has accumulated over the centuries, over millennia, is you can't simply just walk away from that, and that power has carried down into so many dimensions of the church with bishops, with the wealth of the church. So we have this very paradoxical image of the church as this rich, powerful institution, and yet this marginal, what the title of a book that one New Testament scholar is The Marginal Jew, that was who Jesus was, is this contrast. To be honest, where I see the work of Jesus in the contemporary church today is in the work of a lot of women religious, of the nuns who are out there with those people on the margins of society. I share the repellent way in which people can relate to the church's power. But there are still these groups, such as the sisters who are working with the poor, such as the lay people who are working in these charitable organizations. So some of that vision remains, but the institution is a very, very long way from it. So I share the resistance to that image of power. But thank you for that observation and question.
We have an Elena who's making a comment. She says, we never hear from the clergy this facing, just absence or indirect response. This is just a comment. And now, question by Patricia. How do women and theologians, how can they contribute to take forward the topic of universal vocation to sanctity, as in Lumen Gentium and Vatican II, be it in church or in public life? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I was just talking with some friends the other week, some of my colleagues, about how women, we women as theologians, how we can contribute. And I appreciate your bringing up the phrase, the universal vocation to sanctity. I retired from teaching 5 years ago, but I continue to be active, and I continue to write, and I'm right now I'm working with my parish in ways in which we can further educate the adults of the parish, the young adults and older adults. I think one of them is that women theologians have to exercise our voices. And so it's important for me, I feel, to keep writing, to be involved in my church, much as I am in many cases very frustrated with the way that even my local church sometimes does things, which I think my local church is probably one of the better places in the Chicago area to try and be a Catholic. So I think that when I was teaching, I would often say to my students, who would say to me, how can you possibly be a Catholic and a feminist at the same time? And I would say to them, well, I have to live with contradictions and ambiguity. That's what mature life is all about. Nothing is straightforward. Life is always complicated. So I think that it's important for women who are engaged in the work of theology, who are engaged in the work of religious education, hard as it is, that we are offering a role model to the younger people that we teach. And in fact, just yesterday, I received an email from a former student reminding me of the course that she took with me, and how she is still inspired by it. Of course, she writes a letter of recommendation. but that I think that we can have an impact. We can have an impact on the people that we work with, however that work is done. So mine was in theological education, but if we're doing it in catechesis or in the ways that we work in whatever our vocation is, I think that one of the wonderful things about the Catholic Church is the teaching of the communion of saints, that it's not only those who have gone before us, but that we're all called to that vocation of sanctity. And it's not an easy one. That call is not an easy one. And so I would encourage more women to get theological education, difficult as it is these days and unpopular as it is these days, when the idea seems to be to make as much money as possible. So I can only offer the idea that we need to keep our voices active and loud and persistent, and refuse to go away.
Thank you, Professor. Now, question from Célia Souza. She says, my question is related to the administration of the parishes. The power is always male. There's no dialogue, respect, communion and actions. Women are in a greater number. However, they don't participate in decisions. The Marian principle of the church should emphasize the participation of women in church. However, it seems to me it's only a romantic idea for those who do not accept changes. What's your opinion?
Well, the idea that parishes have no dialogue, no communication, no respect is it's very unfortunate, and in many cases it's quite true. You know, I think here Pope Francis, with the Synod on Synodality, is basically saying this should no longer be the case. But there is such a long history and such a tradition, and I see it especially in many of the younger clergy, seminarians, and some of the younger priests who are very taken with the kind of pre-Vatican vision of you know, being clergy and being holier than the congregation. For one thing, at least in the US, there are some women who are suggesting that during Lent, women should withhold all of their contributions to the church. That women should stop contributing money, stop contributing their time, stop contributing any sort of contribution that they can do, so that the church would at least have to pay attention to the fact that it depends so much on women. In terms of parishes, of course, this changes from parish to parish. Some parishes have more responsive clergy. In my own parish, for example, the pastor has said about little less than a year ago that he wanted to enforce the general instruction on the Roman Missal more strictly by not allowing lay people to preach. And that had been a tradition in our church. And there was a huge outcry, and there was a strong amount of resistance. So I would say that women need to organize, which is what this group of women who wants to withhold their services during Lent wants to do. They're protesting the synod's lack of decision on women being ordained as deacons. To make your voices heard, and I have done this myself by writing the pastor and telling him when I didn't like a sermon, that this understanding of male power and male dominance of parish life can only continue when we allow it to continue. And so organization, speaking your voice, keeping communication, and resisting that idea of the quiet virgin who keeps everything in her heart and never speaks up is is a false picture. It's a false picture of what the Marian principle is all about. And as you point out, participation is actually central. Now, I myself am not a big fan of the Marian principle as being completely receptive. But at least in terms of what you're saying, with participation, in here, I think you have to be bold and speak out.
Thank you. Question from Alex Barbosa. In the writings of Lynn Faber Lawrence about the Trinity, she talks about the third person as feminine, Ruah, divine Ruah. This type of approach is positive.
Yes, it is positive in a way. The problem that occurs with saying that of the three persons of the Trinity, we have Father, Son, and Spirit. Spirit is feminine. That what it does is to still maintain the main power in the patriarchal figure of the Father, and the Son, of course, remains the Son. What I worry about is that it kind of pigeonholes. I don't know if the word is in Portuguese, but that it sort of narrows the role of the spirit as kind of marginal. That the third person as spirit, and of course this is language that we see in our tradition. Not enough, I think. The feminine language for the divine. The problem with that is that it is a voice that remains, in a sense, underheard. It remains kind of on the margins, and it remains as literally a kind of inspiration that doesn't really, I think it doesn't really, what I would say, crack the solid patriarchal images that we have. The Holy Spirit is, as I think we know, it gets marginalized. The Holy Spirit is, as one popular culture person said years ago, it's two men and a bird, which is it's kind of a dismissive way of putting it, but there's a germ of truth to it. So I worry about the fact that the creative and the redemptive dimensions of the divine, which is where we see the Father and the Son, are continually seen as male, and that the way that the Spirit is understood as helping to inform the way in which the church works. If that doesn't really share in the creative and the redemptive dimension, then we've marginalized the feminine again.
Thank you, Professor Ross. Next question from Gabriel Villardi. Besides the metaphors, isn't sexism connected to the sexual morality of the ancient church with its views that find little echo in the communities?
So yeah, that was the point of Carolyn Osick's essay, which is that as the early church tried to sort out who it was and what it was going to be in the situation of being in the Roman Empire, the way in which well, so the way in which the church was understood early on, using the language of bride and bridegroom as the early church did and attributed to Christ, it does have a very clear sexual morality in that the bride is always under the rule of the father. That's the Roman pater familias. And so the honor of the family then is associated with the woman. And so I think what happens is the Catholic Church picks up on the Roman understanding of family, not all of it, because I think with with the idea of celibate life and religious communities, that's a kind of what would you say, a way of avoiding the patriarchal character. But the morality of women's sexual behavior is seen here as a model for civil society and for the church. And so it gets into more complicated questions about how the church understands sexuality. For example, women's pleasure is not really ever talked about. Women's sexual pleasure is not ever really talked about as a good that was created by God. Women are the ones who have to monitor men's sexual pleasure and make sure that they don't lead men on into immoral sexual behavior. And so the idea of sexual morality is limited, I think, in terms of its gendered connotations. And that as long as we have unequal distributions of power in our relationships between men and women, I think the ancient biblical writers, their ideas are still very much held by even people in the present. So this is a big problem, and it's not going to be solved overnight. But I think so long as the church tries to, as long as we understand this relationship as this unequal distribution of power, and as the woman as the one who symbolizes the purity of the church, we're not going to have the kind of equality that we would like to see.
Thank you, Professor, for all these important contributions with which you enriched us this morning. We are now on the nick of time, but if you want to say a few words, final words, and then we're going to close our session, our meeting.
Well, I want to, yeah, well, thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm delighted to be able to speak to an audience. I was in Brazil about 9 years ago and enjoyed its beauty and meeting many of the people. I have hope, I think, in two ways. One is that you have a rich theological tradition, and I hope that continues. In the wake of our own political situation in the US, I look at the way in which your political situation changed, and I hope that we maybe can learn something from that in this time that that I'm very concerned about in the US. So, but I think as a church, we need to be together. We need to be careful about our language. But I think we need to, as one of the questioners asked, remember the original vision of Jesus, and that this is really what we are all about, men and women together. And so whatever can serve that larger vision is something that I hope we can maintain.